What if I told you that a single invention, created over 5,000 years ago, changed everything about being human? An invention so revolutionary that it marks the boundary between prehistory and history itself. This wasn't a tool or a weapon, this was writing. And here's what will blow your mind. Writing wasn't invented by poets or philosophers, it was invented by accountants. In ancient Sumer, around 3200 BC, temple administrators faced an impossible problem. They had to keep track of thousands of transactions, grain stored, goods traded, workers paid, debts owed. Their memories weren't enough. Their simple counting systems weren't enough. They needed something that had never existed before, a way to record information permanently. So they invented it. They took a reed, pressed it into wet clay, and created the world's first writing system, Cuneiform. This single innovation would transform human civilization forever. It would enable the first laws, the first literature, the first historical records. It would allow knowledge to be preserved and passed down through generations. In the next 27 minutes, you'll witness the birth of writing itself. You'll see how simple marks in clay evolved into a sophisticated writing system. You'll read the world's oldest surviving literature. You'll understand how this invention marked the moment when humans crossed from prehistory into history. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover is the foundation of all human knowledge. Around 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, something happened that would change human history forever. For the first time, humans learned to record their thoughts, their transactions, and their knowledge in a permanent form. This was the invention of writing, and it marks the moment when humanity crossed from prehistory into history itself. Before writing, knowledge could only be passed down through memory and oral tradition. Stories, laws, records, and information existed only in people's minds. They could be forgotten, changed, or lost. With writing, humans could preserve information across time and space. They could record transactions that happened years ago. They could write down laws that would be remembered exactly as intended. They could preserve stories and knowledge for future generations. The invention of writing was not just a technological innovation, it was a cognitive revolution. It changed how humans thought, how they organized information, and how they managed complex societies. It enabled the development of literature, law, science, and history. It allowed humans to build on the knowledge of previous generations in ways that had never been possible before. The story of how writing was invented is one of the most important stories in human history. It is the story of how humans learned to externalize their thoughts, to create a technology of the mind that would become the foundation of all subsequent human achievement. Why was writing invented? The answer lies in the complexity of Sumerian cities. By 3200 BC, Sumerian cities had grown large and complex. Uruk may have had 50,000 or more inhabitants. The temple economy managed vast amounts of resources, thousands of bushels of grain, hundreds of animals, countless manufactured goods. Trade networks extended across vast distances, involving transactions with many different partners. The scale of economic activity had grown beyond what could be managed through memory alone. Temple administrators needed to keep track of who owed what, who had paid what resources were stored where, and how much of everything existed. They needed to record transactions that had happened months or years ago. They needed to communicate information across distances and through time. They needed to manage the complex coordination required for large-scale projects like building ziggurats or organizing irrigation. Memory was unreliable. Oral communication was limited by distance and time. Simple counting systems weren't sufficient for the complexity of the information that needed to be recorded. The need for writing arose from the practical demands of managing a complex urban economy. It was not created for artistic or literary purposes. It was created to solve a practical problem: how to keep track of information in a society that had become too complex for traditional methods of information management. Before writing, Sumerians used various methods to keep track of information. The earliest accounting systems were simple but effective. One method was to use notches on sticks or marks on clay. A mark could represent a unit, 1 sheep, 1 bushel of grain, 1 worker. Multiple marks could represent larger quantities. But this system had limitations. It could only represent numbers, not what the numbers referred to. A mark could mean a sheep or a bushel of grain or anything else. Context and memory were required to know what was being counted. Another early method was the use of pebbles or stones to represent quantities. Different sized stones could represent different units. But again, this system could only represent numbers, not the objects being counted. These early accounting systems worked for simple transactions, but they became inadequate as economic activity grew more complex. They couldn't record who owed what to whom. They couldn't record when transactions occurred. They couldn't record the terms of agreements. They couldn't preserve information across long periods of time. As Sumerian cities grew larger and their economies more complex, these simple accounting methods became insufficient. Something more sophisticated was needed, a system that could record not just quantities, but also what was being counted, who was involved, when it happened, and the terms of transactions. This need would eventually lead to the development of writing. A crucial step toward writing was the development of tokens and bullae. Tokens were small clay objects in various shapes, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, that represented different commodities. A cone might represent a small measure of grain, a sphere a large measure, a cylinder a sheep, and so on. These tokens could be used to represent quantities of different goods. But tokens had the same limitation as earlier accounting methods. They could only represent quantities, not who owned them, when transactions occurred, or other details. The solution was the bulla, a hollow clay ball. Tokens representing a transaction would be placed inside a bulla, which would then be sealed. The outside of the bulla could be marked with impressions or symbols to identify the parties involved or the nature of the transaction. This system allowed for more complex record keeping, but it still had limitations. To verify what was inside a bulla, it had to be broken open, destroying the record. And the system still couldn't record all the information that complex transactions required. The breakthrough came when someone realized that instead of putting tokens inside a bulla, they could make impressions of the tokens on the outside of a clay tablet. This way, the information was visible without destroying the record. And if they could make impressions of tokens, why not make impressions or marks that represented other things, people, places, actions? This insight would lead directly to the development of pictographic writing. By 3200 BC, the problem of complexity had reached a critical point. Sumerian cities were managing economies of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The temple in Uruk alone might have been tracking thousands of different transactions involving hundreds of different people and dozens of different commodities. Trade networks extended across vast distances, involving partners who spoke different languages and used different systems of measurement. Large-scale projects like building ziggurats required coordinating the work of hundreds or thousands of people over months or years. All of this required information management that went far beyond what memory or simple accounting systems could provide. Administrators needed to record not just quantities, but also names, dates, relationships, agreements, and obligations. They needed to preserve this information for long periods. They needed to communicate it across distances. They needed to verify it when disputes arose. The existing methods, memory, oral communication, simple marks, tokens, and bullae, were all inadequate for this level of complexity. Something fundamentally new was needed. The solution would be writing, a system of symbols that could represent not just numbers, but words, concepts, and information of all kinds. The invention of writing was not a sudden inspiration. It was the inevitable response to a problem that had been growing for centuries. When it came, it would transform human civilization forever. Around 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, the first true writing appeared. These were pictographs, simple pictures that represented objects or concepts. A picture of a head meant a person. A picture of a bowl meant food or grain. A picture of an ox meant cattle. These early pictographs were drawn or scratched into wet clay tablets using a pointed tool, probably a reed stylus. The earliest written tablets from Uruk are almost entirely economic records, lists of commodities, records of transactions, accounts of resources. They show that writing was invented for a very practical purpose, keeping track of the temple's economic activities. The pictographs were simple and direct. They represented concrete objects that could be easily drawn. But even in these earliest examples, we can see the beginning of abstraction. Some symbols represented actions or concepts, not just objects. A symbol might mean not just sheep, but sheep received or sheep given. The system was still very limited. It could only represent a small number of words and concepts. But it was a breakthrough. For the first time, humans could record information in a form that could be read by others, preserved across time, and used to manage complex activities. The invention of pictographic writing was the first step in a revolution that would transform human civilization. The evolution from pictures to symbols was a crucial development. Early pictographs were literal representations. A drawing of a sheep meant a sheep. But as the writing system developed, the symbols became more abstract and conventionalized. They became less like pictures and more like symbols that represented words or concepts. This abstraction was necessary because many words cannot be easily represented by pictures. How do you draw love, or justice, or yesterday? The solution was to use symbols that represented sounds rather than just objects. In Sumerian, many words were made up of syllables, and the same syllable could appear in different words. Writers began to use symbols to represent syllables, not just whole words. A symbol that originally meant water might also be used to represent the syllable a, in other words. This development, called the rebus principle, was revolutionary. It meant that a limited set of symbols could be used to write an unlimited number of words. It also meant that writing could represent abstract concepts, not just concrete objects. The symbols themselves also evolved. The pointed stylus was replaced by a reed with a triangular tip. When pressed into clay, this created wedge-shaped marks, the characteristic cuneiform writing from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The writing became faster to produce and more standardized. By 3000 BC, cuneiform had developed into a sophisticated writing system with hundreds of different signs. The development of writing created a new profession, the scribe. Scribes were highly trained specialists who could read and write cuneiform. Becoming a scribe required years of education. Young men, and occasionally women, would attend scribal schools where they learned to read and write the hundreds of cuneiform signs. They learned vocabulary, grammar, and the conventions of different types of writing. They practiced by copying texts and writing exercises. Scribes were essential to Sumerian society. They kept the records that managed the economy. They wrote the letters that communicated across distances. They recorded the laws that governed society. They preserved the stories and knowledge that defined culture. Scribes held positions of importance and respect. They worked in temples, palaces, and administrative centers. They were well compensated and had opportunities for advancement. Some scribes became administrators or officials. The education required to become a scribe meant that literacy was limited to a small elite. Most people in Sumerian cities could not read or write, but the existence of scribes meant that writing could be used throughout society, even if most people couldn't do it themselves. The profession of the scribe would continue for thousands of years, and scribes would play crucial roles in every ancient civilization. The development of writing created not just a technology, but a new class of educated professionals who would shape the course of human history. Initially, writing was used almost exclusively for economic and administrative purposes. The vast majority of early cuneiform tablets are records of transactions, inventories, accounts, and administrative documents. Writing was a tool for managing the complex economy of Sumerian cities. But as the writing system developed and became more sophisticated, its uses expanded. Writing began to be used for legal purposes. Laws could be written down, creating a permanent record that could be referred to when disputes arose. Contracts could be recorded, providing proof of agreements. Legal decisions could be documented, creating precedents. Writing also began to be used for communication. Letters could be sent across distances, allowing people to communicate without being in the same place. Messages could be preserved and referred to later. This was especially important for trade and diplomacy, where agreements and communications needed to be recorded and remembered. Writing also began to be used for religious purposes. Prayers, hymns, and religious texts could be written down, preserving them exactly as intended. Ritual instructions could be recorded, ensuring they were performed correctly. The expansion of writing's uses showed its versatility and power. What had begun as a tool for accounting had become a technology that could serve many different purposes. This versatility would make writing essential to civilization. One of the most important developments in the history of writing was the creation of literature. Around 2600 BC, Sumerian writers began to use cuneiform not just for practical purposes, but for artistic expression. They began to write stories, poems, and epics. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk. The epic explores themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. It tells of Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu, their adventures together, Enkidu's death, and Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just a story, it is a work of literature that explores deep questions about human existence. It shows that writing had evolved from a practical tool into a medium for artistic and intellectual expression. Other Sumerian literary works include creation myths, hymns to the gods, wisdom literature, and love poetry. These works show the richness and sophistication of Sumerian culture. They also demonstrate the power of writing to preserve culture and transmit it across generations. Without writing, these stories might have been lost or changed beyond recognition. With writing, they could be preserved exactly as their authors intended, allowing future generations to experience the thoughts and feelings of people who lived thousands of years ago. The creation of literature marked a new stage in the development of writing and human culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the world's oldest surviving work of literature. Written over 4,000 years ago, it tells a story that still resonates today. The epic begins with Gilgamesh, the powerful but arrogant king of Uruk, who oppresses his people. The gods create Enkidu, a wild man, to challenge Gilgamesh. But instead of fighting, the two become close friends. Together, they embark on adventures, including a journey to the cedar forest to slay the monster Humbaba. But when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is devastated. He realizes his own mortality and sets out on a quest for immortality. His journey takes him to Utnapishtim, the only human who has achieved immortality, having survived the Great Flood. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that immortality is not possible for humans, but he does reveal the location of a plant that can restore youth. Gilgamesh finds the plant, but a snake steals it while he sleeps. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, having learned that immortality is not the goal, living a meaningful life is. The epic ends with Gilgamesh accepting his mortality and finding meaning in his achievements and his city. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores universal themes that are still relevant today: friendship, loss, the search for meaning, and the acceptance of mortality. It shows that the concerns of ancient people were not so different from our own. The invention of writing changed everything about how humans managed information and knowledge. Before writing, information had to be remembered. Knowledge was stored in human memory and passed down through oral tradition. This limited the amount of information that could be preserved and the accuracy with which it could be transmitted. Writing changed this fundamentally. Information could now be stored outside of human memory, in a permanent, external form. This meant that vast amounts of information could be preserved. Records could be kept for years, decades, or centuries. Knowledge could be accumulated across generations, with each generation building on what previous generations had learned. Writing also enabled the development of complex systems of management and coordination. Laws could be written down and referred to consistently. Contracts could be recorded and verified. Administrative systems could become more sophisticated because information could be preserved and accessed when needed. Writing enabled the development of history, as events could be recorded and preserved. It enabled the development of science, as observations and knowledge could be written down and shared. It enabled the development of literature, as stories and ideas could be preserved in their exact form. Most importantly, writing enabled the transmission of knowledge across time and space. Knowledge could be preserved for future generations and shared across distances. This ability to preserve and transmit knowledge would become one of the defining characteristics of civilization. By 2500 BC, cuneiform writing had become a sophisticated and versatile system. It had evolved from simple pictographs to a complex writing system with hundreds of signs that could represent words, syllables, and concepts. Cuneiform was being used for a wide variety of purposes: economic records, legal documents, letters, religious texts, literature, and more. The writing system had spread beyond Sumer to other regions of Mesopotamia and beyond. The Akkadians, who would later conquer Sumer, adopted cuneiform and adapted it to write their own language. Other peoples in the region also adopted cuneiform, using it to write their own languages while maintaining the same writing system. This spread of cuneiform demonstrates its power and versatility. It was not tied to a single language. It could be adapted to write different languages. This made it a powerful tool for communication and cultural exchange across linguistic boundaries. The development and spread of cuneiform writing was one of Sumer's greatest contributions to human civilization. It provided a model that would influence the development of writing systems throughout the ancient world. Even after Sumerian civilization declined, cuneiform continued to be used for thousands of years, becoming one of the longest-lasting writing systems in history. The invention of writing in Sumer was not just a local achievement, it was a gift to all of humanity. The invention of writing was one of the most important events in human history. It marked the boundary between prehistory and history, the moment when humans could begin to record their own past. It enabled the development of complex civilizations by allowing for the management of information on a scale that had never been possible before. Writing transformed how humans thought, organized information, and managed societies. It enabled the development of law, literature, science, and history. It allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across time and space. It created new professions and new forms of power. Most importantly, writing enabled humans to build on the knowledge of previous generations in ways that had never been possible. Each generation could learn from what previous generations had written, allowing for the accumulation of knowledge and the acceleration of progress. The invention of writing in Sumer was not just a technological achievement, it was a cognitive and cultural revolution. It changed what it meant to be human, enabling new forms of thought, expression, and organization. The impact of writing on human civilization cannot be overstated. Every major civilization since Sumer has depended on writing. Science, law, literature, history, and administration all require writing. The invention of writing was the foundation upon which all subsequent human achievement has been built. The invention of writing in Sumer had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond Mesopotamia. As cuneiform spread to other regions, it influenced the development of writing systems throughout the ancient world. The concept of writing itself spread, inspiring other cultures to develop their own writing systems. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing developed, possibly influenced by the Sumerian example. In the Indus Valley, a writing system emerged that may have been inspired by cuneiform. The idea that information could be recorded in a permanent form spread across the ancient world. But Sumerian influence went beyond just the spread of writing. Sumerian literature, especially the Epic of Gilgamesh, influenced stories and myths throughout the ancient Near East. Sumerian legal concepts influenced the development of law in other civilizations. Sumerian administrative techniques influenced how other societies organized themselves. The invention of writing in Sumer created a template that other civilizations would follow. It demonstrated that writing was not just possible, but essential for complex civilization. It showed how writing could be used for economic, legal, religious, and literary purposes. It provided a model for how knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. The impact of Sumerian writing on human civilization was profound and lasting. It was one of the greatest gifts that Sumer gave to the world, a foundation upon which all subsequent human achievement would be built. We have witnessed one of the most important inventions in human history, the invention of writing. From the first pictographs scratched into clay to the sophisticated cuneiform system, we've seen how humans learned to externalize their thoughts and preserve their knowledge. We've explored how writing was invented not by poets, but by accountants who needed to manage complex economies. We've seen how it evolved from simple pictures to a versatile system that could represent any concept. We've discovered how writing enabled the first laws, the first literature, and the first historical records. We've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving work of literature. But the story of Sumerian civilization is far from complete. In our next episode, we will explore the religious and political systems that shaped Sumerian society. We'll meet the gods who ruled the Sumerian world, An, Enlil, Enki, and the pantheon that influenced every aspect of life. We'll discover how religion and politics were intertwined, with temples serving as centers of both spiritual and temporal power. We'll learn about the first kings, the development of kingship, and how Sumerian city-states were governed. We'll explore the epic struggles between cities, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the political innovations that would influence civilizations for thousands of years. Join us in episode 4 as we discover how gods and kings shaped the world's first civilization. We've just explored the invention that changed everything: writing. From the first marks in clay to the Epic of Gilgamesh, we've witnessed how humans learned to record their thoughts and preserve their knowledge forever. But this is only part of the incredible story of Sumerian civilization. In our next episode, we'll dive deep into the world of gods and kings. You'll meet the Sumerian pantheon, the powerful deities who ruled over every aspect of life. You'll discover how religion and politics were completely intertwined, with temples serving as both spiritual centers and seats of power. You'll learn about the first kings, how kingship developed, and the epic struggles between city-states. You'll explore how Sumerian political innovations influenced civilizations for thousands of years. This is a story of divine power, human ambition, and the complex systems that govern the world's first civilization. If you've been captivated by the invention of writing, if you want to understand how religion and politics shaped ancient Sumer, then make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss episode 4. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to life. Like this video if you want to see more about the empires that shook the world. Comment below and tell us, what surprised you most about the invention of writing? What are you most excited to learn about Sumerian gods and kings? And share this video with anyone who loves history and wants to understand how civilization truly began. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode, where we'll discover how gods and kings ruled the world's first civilization. Until then, remember, every word you read, every law you follow, every story you know, they all began with marks in clay 5,000 years ago in Sumer.